Frank was turning 30, broke, about to lose the only woman who ever believed in him. And here's the part that made it worse. Even when he had a job, he had never once in his life seen real money, not close to it, just enough to survive the month, then start again from zero, month after month, year after year. That morning, lying on a mattress on the floor of the same room he'd slept in since he was 12, Frank didn't know his life was about to change. He just knew he was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. His phone buzzed. "My dad is asking when our traditional wedding list will be needed. I told him soon. Please, Frank, don't make me a liar." He read it 3 times, like the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. He knew that message wasn't really from her, not the anger in it anyway. It was her father's voice borrowed through her fingers. The same father who'd stopped asking Frank, "How's the job search?" and started asking BC in front of Frank, "How long is this young man going to keep you waiting?" Frank had sat at that dinner table 3 weeks ago and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. A man with 11,000 naira in his account and no job does not raise his voice in another man's house. He opened his bank app anyway, the way you press a bruise to check if it still hurts. It still hurt. The number on the screen wouldn't cover a decent birthday dinner for 2, let alone a bride price list, let alone a life. He almost laughed. 30 years old and the biggest amount he'd ever held in that account, even back when he was working himself sick at a job that ate his evenings and his weekends, was never enough to call money, just enough to keep him starving, just enough to keep him coming back. He'd quit that job 8 months ago, and if he was honest, the quitting hadn't been brave, it had been desperate. He was drowning slowly there and told himself drowning quickly somewhere else had to be better. 8 months later, nothing had called. No interview had turned into an offer. Some companies hadn't even bothered to reject him. They just went silent, and the silence was somehow worse, because at least a rejection meant someone had read his name. Through the wall, his mother was on the phone, her voice pitched low, the kind of low that carries further than shouting ever could. "He's still trying," she said, and something in Frank's chest folded in on itself because he could hear, underneath her words, that she didn't fully believe them anymore either. His mother, who used to introduce him to church members as "my son, the one working in town," now changed the subject when his name came up. He wasn't angry at her for it. That was the worst part. He understood completely. He stood and looked in the mirror they'd had since he was a teenager, the silver worn away at one corner, and rehearsed, quietly, the sentence he now knew by heart, the one he'd need the next time BC's family asked what he did for a living. He had said it so many times, it no longer felt like his own voice. Here is the part nobody tells you about hitting rock bottom. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It arrives in small, exact humiliations, in a father's question you're not allowed to answer honestly, in a mother who has quietly stopped defending you, in loving someone enough to marry her and having absolutely nothing to place beside that love except the promise that it would somehow be enough. Frank didn't cry. He wasn't the type. He sat on the edge of that mattress for a long time, phone in his hand, staring at nothing. And somewhere in that silence, a decision formed, quiet, almost embarrassed at its own size. By the time I turn 31, this will never happen to me again. He had no idea yet what that promise would cost him, or who would almost make him break it. The next morning, Frank left the house before 8 for the first time in months, with no interview to attend, no CV in his bag, nothing left to lose. He walked past the estate gate, past shops just opening, past boys hawking recharge cards, until he reached the far end of his street where nobody really walked. The newer houses, built by people who clearly had money and no time to maintain it. And there, he noticed something he had passed 100 times without seeing. Every compound on that stretch was filthy. Not abandoned dirty, neglected dirty. Moss climbing the interlocking stones, oil stains from generators nobody bothered to wipe down. Dust caked so thick on the fences that a finger dragged through it left a clean, dark line. Frank had spent 8 months chasing jobs that demanded degrees, interviews, connections, capital he didn't have. And here, on a street he had walked 1,000 times, was work that demanded none of that. Only 2 hands and the willingness to do something his old self would have called beneath him. That was the real obstacle. It had never been the money. It was the pride. He stood there and felt something close to shame, not at the dirt on the fences, but at himself, for having walked past this 100 times and never once seen it, because some part of him still believed a man with his ambition had no business scrubbing another man's gate. He had no idea yet how far that one decision would take him, or how close it would come to costing him everything before it gave him anything back. He didn't start with a plan. He started with a bucket. Frank went home that afternoon and stood in front of his own family's gate, the one nobody in the house had cleaned in longer than anyone could remember, and did the only thing that made sense. He cleaned it himself. No machine, no money for one, just a stiff broom, a bucket of water mixed with detergent his mother used for the floors, and 2 hours of scrubbing until his shoulders burned and his shirt stuck to his back. When he stepped back to look at it, something in his chest shifted. The gate wasn't perfect, but it was clean, properly clean, for the first time in years. And Frank realized he had just done, for free, exactly the kind of work he'd walked past 100 times without seeing. He took a photo, before and after, side by side. That evening, he posted it in his estate's WhatsApp group with a short message: compound cleaning, affordable rates, first job available this weekend. He didn't expect much. Most people in that group posted things that got 2 replies and silence. By the next morning, he had 3. The first was a woman 2 streets down who wanted her fence and walkway done before a weekend event. Frank named a price that felt embarrassingly small to him and still watched her hesitate before agreeing. He almost apologized for asking to be paid at all. Old habits, old shame. But he didn't. He showed up on Saturday with the same broom and bucket, plus a length of hose he borrowed from a neighbor, and worked for 4 hours under a sun that didn't care about his dignity. She paid him in full, cash in hand, and said something that stayed with him longer than the money did. "I've been meaning to get this done for months. Nobody ever comes to ask. Nobody ever comes to ask." Frank turned that sentence over in his head the whole walk home. Every fence on that street was proof that demand had been sitting there, ignored, waiting for someone willing to be seen doing the work. The second client didn't go as smoothly. A man 3 compounds away agreed to a job, let Frank complete it start to finish, and then, standing at his own gate, tried to negotiate the price down, after the work was already done. Frank felt the old humiliation rise in his throat. The urge to just accept whatever was offered, because arguing felt like begging, and beggars don't argue. But he thought of BC's father's voice, and he held his ground, calmly, and asked for what they'd agreed. The man paid, grudgingly. Frank learned something from that exchange that he would use for the rest of his life. From that day forward, he asked for a deposit before starting and the rest on completion. Not because he distrusted every client, but because he had just watched up close what happens to a man who doesn't protect the value of his own work. Word moved faster than he expected. A phone number here, a name there. Within 3 weeks, Frank wasn't waiting for people to find his post anymore. He was walking compound to compound with a simple flyer he'd designed himself for almost nothing, listing what he did and what it cost. He had no machine, no branding, no team, just a growing list of names in his phone and calluses forming on his palms that hadn't been there in years. By the 6th week, something had changed that Frank almost didn't notice until it hit him directly. He was turning down more jobs than he was taking, simply because there weren't enough hours in a day to scrub every fence by hand. That was the day he finally rented his first machine, a small petrol-powered pressure washer, paid for out of money he had earned with nothing but a bucket and his own 2 hands. He didn't buy it, he rented it, per job, exactly enough to cover the ones he already had lined up, because he wasn't going to make the mistake of spending money he didn't yet trust would keep coming. The first time he used it, he stood there watching years of grime lift off a wall in seconds, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly, not yet. Just proof. Proof that the decision he'd made on his birthday, sitting on that mattress with 11,000 naira to his name, hadn't been foolish after all. But proof wasn't money in the bank, and Frank was about to learn that the next stage of this journey would test him in ways a stubborn client and a sore back never could. By month 3, Frank's problem was no longer finding clients, it was finding hours. He was up before 5 a.m. most days, mixing detergent in the dark, dragging a rented machine from one compound to the next, sometimes doing 2 full jobs before noon, and turning down a third because his arms simply had nothing left to give. His phone, once silent for months at a stretch, now buzzed with messages he couldn't answer fast enough. He was making more in a good week than he used to make in a month at the job he'd quit, and yet he had never felt more stretched, more tired, more aware of his own limits. There were nights he sat outside, back against the wall, too exhausted to eat the food his mother had kept warm for him, and thought about Bisi. He hadn't told her family anything yet. He wasn't ready to speak until the numbers meant something. But he told her, quietly, one evening on a phone call, that something was changing, even if he couldn't yet say what. She didn't ask for proof. She just said, "I believe you." And Frank held on to those 3 words the way a drowning man holds on to anything that floats. But belief doesn't scrub fences, and Frank knew, deep down, that he had built himself a very well-paying prison. He was the machine. If he didn't work, nothing moved. If he got sick, the money stopped. He'd escaped one kind of trap, unemployment, and quietly built himself into another, a business that could not survive one single day without him. That realization was what pushed him toward the hardest decision so far, harder in its own way than the decision on his birthday. He needed to hire someone. He thought of Emeka first, a younger man from his community, someone he'd known in passing for years, currently doing odd jobs here and there, sharp, strong, and clearly hungry for something steady. Frank offered him a simple arrangement. Emeka would help on jobs, paid per job completed, and if things went well, more responsibility would follow. Emeka agreed almost before Frank finished the sentence. For the first few weeks, it worked better than Frank had dared hope. With 2 of them, jobs that used to take a full day took half of one. Frank could finally take on the bigger compounds he'd been turning away, the ones with long perimeter walls, multiple gates, driveways thick with years of neglect. He started training Emeka not just to work, but to talk to clients, to quote jobs, to represent the business the way Frank himself would. It felt for the first time like something bigger than one man with a bucket. It felt like a company. And then, quietly, without any dramatic warning, something started to feel wrong. A client Frank had been meaning to follow up with mentioned almost casually that, "Your guy already gave me a price for next month." Frank paused. He hadn't sent anyone to quote that job. He asked which guy. The client said Emeka's name like it was the most normal thing in the world, because to the client it was. Why wouldn't the man who showed up and did the work also be the one to arrange the next one? Frank said nothing to the client. He said nothing to Emeka either, not yet. He went home that night and sat with a feeling he hadn't expected. Not just anger, but something closer to grief. The specific ache of realizing that trust you gave freely had quietly been spent behind your back. Over the next week, the picture became clearer and uglier. 2 more clients, unprompted, mentioned dealing directly with Emeka. One for a job, one for a cheaper price since there's no need to pay 2 people. Frank understood, with the cold, sinking certainty, exactly what was happening. The young man he had trained, fed opportunities to, and treated as a partner in everything but name, was quietly building his own client list using Frank's brand, Frank's reputation, Frank's word of mouth, and cutting Frank out of deals Frank himself had made possible. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't loud. Frank asked directly. Emeka didn't even bother denying it fully. He shrugged and said something about, "Everybody has to survive." as if loyalty were a luxury he couldn't afford, as if Frank hadn't been extending exactly the kind of chance nobody had extended to him. Frank let him go that same day. That night was one of the lowest of the entire year, lower in some ways than the birthday that started it all. Because rock bottom on his birthday had been about lack, this was about betrayal, and betrayal cuts differently. He sat with the very real temptation to go back to doing everything alone, to trust no one, to shrink the business back down to the size of exactly one man, because at least then nobody could take anything from him again. But shrinking back wasn't a decision Frank could afford to make. He had a woman waiting on a promise, a father counting months, a mother who had started tentatively to defend him again. Going back wasn't protection. It was surrender wearing a disguise. So instead, Frank did something harder than staying angry. He got structural. Frank spent the next few days not looking for a new hire, but fixing the holes that had let the old one walk away with pieces of his business. He didn't just need help. He needed a business that couldn't be stolen from him underneath him again. He wrote down in a plain notebook simple rules that had never existed before because he'd never needed them when it was just him and a bucket. Clients would pay him directly, never the person doing the physical work. Every job, however small, got a basic agreement, sometimes just a message exchange confirming price and scope, but written, not spoken, not assumed. Payments were staggered, part up front, part on completion, so no single job could be walked away from without consequence on either side. And crucially, he stopped putting all his trust and all his client-facing responsibility in one person. From now on, there would always be more than one set of hands on the team, so no single person held the keys to everything he'd built. He hired 2 people this time, not one, a small crew instead of a single deputy. And he kept himself deliberately as the only face clients dealt with directly. It felt slower at first, more cautious, less like the fast trust he'd extended to Emeka. But slower and intact beat fast and stolen. Around this time, something else began happening that Frank hadn't planned for. Clients, pleased with clean fences and driveways, started asking a different question. Do you also handle pest issues? We've been having problems with fumigation. At first, he simply said no and moved on, but after the 4th person asked, Frank started to see it for what it was. Not a random request, but a gap standing right in front of him, the same way dirty fences had stood in front of him a year earlier. He didn't already know fumigation. He had no certificate, no training, no chemicals, but he had something more valuable than any of that, existing trust with a growing list of clients. So he found a local chemical supplier who handled pest control products, and instead of asking to buy from him, Frank asked to learn from him, offering to send him business in exchange for being shown, hands-on, how the work was actually done. The supplier agreed. Frank spent weekends shadowing him on real jobs, learning by doing, and paid for a short, affordable certification once he was confident enough to advertise the service under his own name. Within a month, he was offering both services as a bundle to his existing clients. 1 visit, 2 problems solved. It wasn't a new business. It was the same trust extended sideways. That single decision changed the trajectory of everything. Estates that had only ever needed him twice a year for cleaning now had a reason to call monthly. Word moved between properties the way it always had, not through advertising, but through people talking to people who trusted them. And then in month 10, the call came that changed the scale of the entire story. An estate management company, overseeing several properties at once, reached out after hearing about him through a client. They didn't want one job. They wanted a standing contract, regular cleaning and pest control across multiple properties, paid on a recurring basis. Frank sat with that offer for a full day before responding, because he understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't one more client. This was the difference between a man doing jobs and a man running a company. He said yes. By the time his 31st birthday arrived, Frank wasn't the same man who had once opened a banking app the way you press a bruise just to feel it still hurt. He had 2 service lines, a small but steady team, a recurring contract that alone brought in more in a month than his old job used to pay in half a year, and a phone that rang now, not with rejection, but with people asking when he was available.
He wasn't sitting on a lump sum untouched in an account, and he was honest with himself about that. Some of what the business made had gone back into it: better equipment, wages, supplies. Some he had saved. Some he had, finally, been able to give to his family without being asked. But when he added it up honestly, contracts secured, revenue earned across the year, the value of what he now owned and controlled, the number crossed 7 figures, not many sitting untouched. Something better, a business that made that number and could make it again. His mother asked him the same question she had asked indirectly a year earlier: what he was doing with his life. This time, Frank didn't rehearse an answer. He just told her the truth, plainly, and watched her face change in a way he'd remember for the rest of his life. He called BC's father himself, not to ask permission this time, but to invite him to see with his own eyes what he had built. There was no wedding list conversation that day. There didn't need to be one. The proof was already standing in front of him. If there's one thing Frank's year proves, it's this: you don't need capital to start. You need willingness. You don't need a perfect plan. You need to protect what you build with real structure, not just trust. And you don't need a completely new skill to grow. Sometimes the next opportunity is standing right beside the one you already have, waiting for you to be humble enough to see it. Frank didn't get here from a clever idea. He got here from doing the thing he was once too proud to do and doing it properly.